Tēnā koutou katoa, good afternoon, and a very well welcome to Te Whare Wānaka, Aoraki, Lincoln University, and this excellent series here today. It is a real privilege to host Theorising Matunga for this seminar. Professor Matunga is a highly respected scholar whose career has spanned decades, focusing on Māori self-determination through planning, environmental management, design, and policy. His work sits at the intersection of Indigenous knowledge, research, and practice, and has shaped thinking in Aotearoa New Zealand and internationally. Pyrenees' research and professional contributions are extraordinary. From his early experiences growing up in the Hawke's Bay, he has drawn insight and inspiration that has guided his work. Over the years, he's developed approaches such as strategic Indigenous impact assessments, and is currently rethinking urban heritage and landscape management through an Indigenous lens. Today's seminar is especially significant because Pyrenee is retiring at the end of this month. We are incredibly fortunate to have him here to share his insights, reflections, and decades of experience before he steps down from his formal academic life. Please join me in giving a warm up to Pyrenee here today.
Oh, kia ora katoa. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou. No, my karamai. I've made the first mistake. I left my presentation back in my office. I wanted to do this school. And just we'll take it from there. But yeah, look, as Grant said, I'm 2 weeks from retirement, and when I was preparing for this, I was thinking, yeah, it seems like a bit of an autopsy or an autobiography of my career, spanning 45 years or so. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over, I think, the critical issues that I've not only learned, but hopefully assisted in the development of. So my career has not been a straight line. It's been a bit curvy. You know, down a few cul-de-sacs, one or two dead ends. But with this determination to fixate on the meaning of Māori self-determination. So this is going to be a bit of a retrospective of 45 years, crammed into 20 minutes, or 30 minutes. And if we need a methodology to kind of cover this, I think perhaps auto-reflexive ethnography might just be the methodology. But from my point of view, it's really just, I suppose, the whakapapa of my career. And that career has been at the intersection between the very personal. So when I talk about these issues, they are personal. Obviously political and hopefully, question mark, scholarly. But whatever, they are inseparable. So how do I work this? Just push that. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to provoke a bit. And look, you need to prod me when I'm getting a bit close to my 30 minutes. So the title of my presentation, as you see, is Theorising my Emancipation from Colonialism and Planning and various other practices. So I don't just leave it at planning, I kind of stretch the boundaries a little bit. And this is a photograph of me standing next to my great-great-grandfather, or the image of my great-great-grandfather carved in Italian marble, earlier this year. So initially I was thinking, shall I call this talk Conversations with Myself, Conversations with my great-great-grandfather, but I removed that. But I thought, in a way, that image captures what this is all about. So that's my beginning. Why? Who am I? Ko hei pipi te kūnanga, te waiopinanga te awa, o ngā whakaari ngā te matepu, o kuhapu, Petane Pa, whakakainga, te amiki te whare nui, ena re pōhio, the gentleman with me, or I'm with the gentleman, sorry. For tipuna, who was born in 1844, 4 years after the Treaty of Waitangi was signed, and died at the age of 70 in 1914. And I've just let the hat out of the bag, that whatever it is, that I'm actually 70. I realise that. So, born in 1955. But look, I want to introduce you just kind of briefly to my world as a child growing up at the park. You always call it the park. Up the top, that photograph up the top is one side of the Te Whare, and the Te Whare was a refuge for my hapu, many of who were massacred during the musket wars in the 1820s. And so when I say ko Te Punanga, ko Te Punanga means Te the refuge, you know, the place of solitude but refuge. Come further down, that's the Waihinganga River, Awa, and we swam in that river as kids all the time, so that was our river. So when I recite my pepeha, I'm talking about our river, and I mean it, because we swam in there, kind of fished every now and then, but we recreated in that river our Awa. And down the bottom here is the Te Amiki, which is the wharenui, or the meeting house, that my great-great-grandfather actually built. A beautiful small whare that housed our hapu over many decades. So kind of that's me, and that's what I bring to this, not only this presentation, but this taupapa. I want to start almost with my conclusion, and I think this is what's really driven my career. And that is, if I grew up in a planned settlement, but we kind of never called it planning, so I didn't actually know what planning was, to be honest, but it was nonetheless planned. My tipuna designed the settlement, and I'll show you in the next slide what he did. But it was nonetheless planned. So my tipuna hinare, I categorise or refer to as both a planner and an architect. You know, we didn't use those words, but he nonetheless did that. He was a planner, but he was also an architect because he designed wharenui. But I just want to make a point here, it's a bit of a provocation, and that is that Indigenous, First Nations, First Peoples, tribal country planning is actually the first planning in all colonies. It's actually the first planning in all colonies across the world. Whether that colony is Aotearoa, Turtle Island, Kanata, I'm not sure about that guy. I think I got that right, it's Iroquois. Country in Australia, Palestine, plus 65 other nations across the globe. So what I'm really putting out there is that Indigenous planning, as we've come to know it today, is the first planning. Now, my evidence for that is really, this is Petane Pa. So this is where I grew up. Okay, so when the settlement was being designed, there was a clarity around where, obviously this is a Google shot, you know, so just in case you're wondering. But it was very clear at the part as I was growing up where the residential areas were. So the residential areas are there were three kind of residential zones. There was the Marae with the yellow arrow to it. Can I use this to point? Can I point with this? Oh, okay, cool. So these are the residential zones. So they're running along this stretch here out to the main highway. This area was dedicated for marae and community facilities. This area there. There was our Urupa cemetery, Karakia or church. There was also the large area of space there was for production, for productive purposes. And when I was growing up, it was used as market garden. Okay, so these areas were all separated out for specific uses, and there was also an orchard here, and here is the river running along this boundary here. So really, what this kind of depicts, at least for me, growing up there, was Ngāti Matipu and Ngāti Whakaare. Policy and aspirations spatialised. So it's taking policy and aspirations and it's spatialising them on the landscape. And that was certainly what was done. So this is what I grew up, you know, I grew up knowing that our people did planning. Okay, didn't know it was planning, but nonetheless, that's exactly what it was. So this is my part of the issue here is, in a way, Petane Pa was part of a grand kind of narrative where colonialism met Indigenous. Because this grand narrative where colonialism met Indigenous. I mean, war did the hard bit. War did the hard bit. Conflict and land confiscation did the hard bit. But war policy and then planning kind of smoothed it over a bit more. Okay. So I think this is where the tension still sits. Okay, I think the tension still sits in this space. It's kind of mediation between, you know, colonialism on the one and Indigenous on the other. So competition for land, imposition of colonial government, imposition of law, policy, colonial planning, colonial design, and what I refer to as colonial everything. So really what I'm going to talk about is planning as a mediator between that. In Aotearoa New Zealand, clearly our nationhood is grounded in three, you know, critical constitutional documents, which in a way provides the kind of framework for our duality as a nation. As we know, they're the Declaration of Independence, Te Whare, and also the New Zealand Constitution Act 1852. So these three documents have, in a way, guided my career. I've always seen them as a triumvirate and as a framework, not only for the kind of duality in our engagement with each other as peoples, but also as partners in this endeavour of creating a nation. So our nationhood is grounded in these three constitutional documents, clearly. Another way that I've always conceptualised for instance, the Treaty of Waitangi is Aotearoa New Zealand's first national policy statement, and also Aotearoa's first national plan. So when you look at the text of the Treaty of Waitangi, I mean, it pretty much says it all. Queen of England acknowledges and guarantees to the chiefs, the sub-tribes and all the people of New Zealand the entire supremacy of their lands, of their settlements and of all their possessions. So I think the framework was laid clearly down during the state of early colonialism. Right, this is a diagram that I've often used with my classes over the years. Really just to illustrate, however, that from that really promising start in this country, the Declaration, Treaty and the New Zealand Constitution Act, 1852, it essentially took over 130 years, 137 years for Māori to be included or recognised in the planning system. under the 1977 Town and Country Planning Act. Okay, so from that promising start here to the Town and Country Planning Act, 137 years later, it took that period of time for Māori and our relationships with ancestral lands to be recognised as a matter of national planning importance. Okay, so in a way, there's been this kind of legitimation of exclusion for a vast period of our history as a country. And it wasn't until 1977 and the inclusion of Section 3(1)G in the Town and Country Planning Act that for the first time a window was open for Māori to enter our planning system in this country. So in the Town Planning Act 1926, no reference to Māori. In the Town and Country Planning Act 1953, once again, no reference to Māori at all. And it wasn't until 1977 that there was recognition of the relationship between Māori, their culture and traditions with ancestral lands as a matter of national planning importance. And I've got a little story about this too, which I'll tell you about. Even Section 3(1)G barely made it into the 1977 Town and Country Planning Act, and it was only through some pretty heavy-duty negotiating on the part of the New Zealand Māori Council that Section 3(1)G actually made it into the Town and Country Planning Act in 1977, and it was a late night call from Sir Graham Latimer, who at that stage was the chairman of the New Zealand Māori Council, to Sir Robert Muldoon, who was the Prime Minister at the time. And Sir Graham imploring Robert Muldoon to include a provision similar to Section 3(1)G in order to open the door for Māori into the planning system in this country. Okay, working our way through this chronology. Probably one of the greatest innovations in the Resource Management Act 1991 was the inclusion of iwi management plans. A major inclusion into sort of planning in this country, and I'll touch on those briefly. Okay, so that's kind of the chronology of, in a way, planning in Aotearoa over a period of 140 years or so. Right, I want to kind of introduce you to another chronology, and this is where I kind of inject myself into the process here. Okay, so we started in 1977 Town Planning Act, and in particular Section 3(1)G, recognising the relationship of Māori, their culture and traditions with their ancestral lands as a matter of national planning importance. In the early 1980s, there were a number of documents that were prepared that in a way kind of led the way for how to deal with Māori planning in our mainstream planning system in this country. And I was involved pretty much in all of these in some way or another. So, but what you'll see is how the language kind of changes slightly. The first report, and bearing in mind it's only a few years after the Town and Country Planning Act came in 1977, one of the first was a report prepared by a colleague of mine, Ree Anderson, entitled Planning for Māori Needs. So in the early days, there was still this kind of notion of planning for Māori needs rather than them doing their own planning. Okay, so it's quite clear that in a way Māori were still slightly outside of the system, and someone else was going to be doing the planning for us. I think that came through in a way in Ree's report, which is a brilliant report, but it still had this kind of needs-based focus for Māori. In that same year, though, the Māori Planning Kit was prepared, And the Māori planning kit was a more unambiguous reference to Māori doing their own planning, which I thought, which was absolutely critical for the time. And that came through in a report prepared by the Māori Planning Committee up in Auckland and under the authorship of Pauline King and George Asher. Now, at this time, I think I was one of the few Māori planners in the country. Well, I'll introduce you to the other one, that's George Asher. So George co-authored the Māori Planning Kit. In that same year, I, as a lowly recent graduate, doing the planning degree at the University of Auckland, I prepared my research essay. In those days, you never had any supervisors, just kind of did it. And so I really went for it in my research essay. And I really started introducing this notion of duality in planning. And the title of my research essay was Planning in Aotearoa, a Dual Heritage. And really what this is doing is it's kind of reflecting how I grew up. At the time I knew we did planning. And I finally had a language and a vocabulary to describe what we had been doing all along. We lived in planned settlements. Our tipuna did planning. So what I did is I grabbed my upbringing and I built it into my humble research essay, and really just kind of started teasing out this idea of, hold on a minute, we have a treaty. The treaty has a duality inherent in it, and therefore so is our planning. Okay, it's time to start embracing duality in our planning heritage. So that was built into my research. So that's 40 years ago now, isn't it? So yeah, it's going back a bit. Fast forward another 8 or 9 years, and we're now into a major review of the Resource Management Act. That created the Resource Management Act, sorry. So still working under the Town and Country Planning Act, 1977, getting a sense of where Māori planning sit, and people like myself introducing this notion of duality in our planning and duality in our nation. I was invited to then in 1989 prepare a report on Māori and local government, which I did. And so when you feel as though history is repeating itself ad nauseum, it's really local government that does it for me. In a way, you can see the orderly progression of planning and resource management through time. But local government, I think, is really still an issue for this country. And what I did in my report is I made a number of recommendations. One was that there needed to be a Māori Local Government Treaty Commission created. Now, we're talking 1989, so it's 40 or so years ago. That there be a Māori ward for each region and each district. All of the regions in the districts in the country need a Māori ward. Each ward had 2 Māori members, etc., etc. So these recommendations were included in my report and submitted to government. Oh, I've got 10 minutes left. Okay, so I need to go. Thank you. Anyway, so there was that. So that report was submitted to government, and the minister at the time, Michael Bassett, just roundly rejected all the conclusions. Okay, and we're still in that quagmire up to a point. I was then involved with probably the first iwi management plan ever prepared in this country. I know that Te Whakatau Kaupapa was another one. Ngā Tipanga o Ngā Te Apa tribal policy statement. So I worked very closely with Ngāti Kumanhinik and their tribe on the preparation of that. And then we have the Resource Management Act. Now, look, I'm going to go breakneck speed through the rest of my presentation. What I want to state with this, with the Ngā Tikanga or Ngā Titiata, it is such a visionary document, and that is down to Dame Ngāneko Mintena. It really pushes it out on the meaning of rangatira, the meaning of self-determination, etc., etc. So it's a privilege for me to work with Ngāneko in the late 80s on the preparation of their iwi management plan, which I still think is a guide for many iwi management plans to follow even today. Key principles were self-determination, self-sufficiency, and kaitiaki. Iwi planning documents, you know, the real triumph of the Resource Management Act. This is my view, and I'm talking, so yeah, iwi management plans are the real, I think, the major innovation of the RMA. And the reason for that is they're a critical connector between colonial planning and Indigenous planning. They're an opportunity to articulate the meaning of tino rangatira in an unambiguous way. I was getting the four-half planning system come the late 1990s. I think it's not long after I started here in Grant. I was getting about, about planning in this country, so I was invited to write by the late Professor Ali Mema, write something about it, which is probably what I did. And so I authored a chapter in Ali's book entitled Decolonising Planning, the Treaty of Waitangi, the environment, and once again inserting this notion of duality in a dual planning tradition. The reason why I was foreha about the Resource Management Act, national policy statement, none was ever prepared, and still isn't there. And there was only one transfer of power under Section 33. So that was my indicator as to why I think the RMA really needed to tighten up. So this is where I got into, okay, how do we flip the script on this, folks? How do we move the rate of decolonising on a bit more quickly? And that's when I came across a lot of the writing of Paulo Freire. And the aphorism of Paulo Freire that really stuck with me was name the word, name the world. Name the word, name the world. And so I really got, thinking, okay, let's just name Indigenous planning. Name it, just name it. Don't forever hitch it to colonial planning. Let's give it something. And hence, this notion of planning is not just a word, but it's also an imperial scholarly discipline and colonial practice located in the West. Now, I'm quoting myself, which is a bit mad, I know, but it's probably the easiest way for me to capture it. So I suppose what I was trying to say, indicate was that we need to name something, and let's name it Indigenous planning. Okay, so if colonial planning has been used as a tool to address, map and spatialise the question of indigeneity, Indigenous planning equally can become a tool to emancipate, decolonise and indeed spatialise indigeneity. Okay, so I wrote my chapter in this book, Reclaiming Indigenous Planning, and I was in a way asked to do a theory kind of analysis of what Indigenous planning might look like. So this is what I did. People, place-based planning of the land since time immemorial, etc., etc. But anyway, if you want to have a look, we've got three copies of the book in the library. It's a bit expensive to buy it on Amazon, so I wouldn't buy it, but I'll certainly get one of our copies. But and this is what I laid out. I think the framework for Indigenous planning as an international construct. And I'm just nudging some of the theorising I did in this, because really all that chapter was for me was trying to comprehend a space for Indigenous planning to exist. It's like walking from one room into another, walking from a room with a label colonial planning on it into another room with a label on it called Indigenous planning. So this was a conscious decision to move out of a colonial approach to planning and comprehend Indigenous planning. Bearing in mind, I grew up at Pa, and I realised after all these years that our people have always done planning. So Indigenous planning reclaimed. So if I take that now, and I'm kind of continually nudging this along with my plan. Indigenous planning is planning grounded in indigeneity. What it means is planning grounded in Indigenous sovereignty, Indigenous ontology, Indigenous epistemology, and Indigenous axiology. So for me, that's what Indigenous planning means. It's this planning is a universal, but grounded in indigeneity. Sovereignty, ontology, epistemology, and axiology. Not only that, but it's a framework for decolonising, colonial planning through Indigenous planning. Okay, and I thought, well, okay, why stop at planning? It's 5 minutes. Right. Okay, why stop at planning? So I thought, well, okay, why don't we flip the script even further? Don't stop at planning. Flip the script on policy, design, development, etc., as well. So we take policy and design and we run this through this framework, we end up with Indigenous policy is policy grounded in indigeneity. Namely that. Indigenous design is design grounded in that. And once again, the kind of mirror image of not only indigenising, but also a framework for decolonising, if you're following my drift. To get you to this. Okay, so if we, so I've been working on this idea of a draft kind of taxonomy or typology for Indigenous self-determination. So it started with policy, with planning, but it extends through to policy, design, development, etc. And very, very quickly, we have a framework for Indigenous self-determination. And I've got draft into the question mark and all the rest of it to cover myself. But I'm positing that as a draft tentative taxonomy for policy, planning, design, even impact assessment, building in Indigenous knowledge and data sovereignty, evaluation and review, etc. But a framework that we can actually look at for Indigenous self-determination. Which leads me to the, I've got 1 minute, haven't I? Yep. Which leads me to the final, and this is where I'm kind of today. I'm thinking, okay, well, let's carry on pushing the boat out on this. We started with planning, Indigenous planning. Pretty quickly for me, I was talking about Indigenous planning, and I realised, well, I'm not only talking about Indigenous planning, I'm actually talking about Indigenous policy, Indigenous design, Indigenous development. So hence building it out into a broader framework for Indigenous self-determination. But I think the other thing, I was lucky enough to, thank you, Grant, attend 2 international conferences last year. One on impact assessment in Bologna, and another on archaeology. So 2 quite different disciplines. And I ran that framework by Indigenous archaeologists in Australia. And I think I presented on that at the impact assessment conference, didn't I? And it did resonate. It did resonate. So, I mean, that gave me kind of a bit of a boost to carry on going. Let the script keep on going. And, if you're onto a minute, just keep on going. Which is what I did when I got to this. So what I'm really working on at the moment is this notion of Indigenous theory and practice. Policy, planning, design, development, management, impact assessment. Archaeology, quite different. Impact assessment, kind of similar, but archaeology quite different. And the Indigenous archaeologists in in Darwin last year, the Aboriginal Indigenous archaeologists grabbed that. So I knew that I was kind of on to something. And so really what I'm positioning that now is Indigenous theory and practice, and pretty much Indigenous everything. Okay, and I think it's something that we do need to think about. So what I am doing is I'm positioning this as firstly stating the emancipatory power of a meta theory for indigeneity. So I'm putting this out there, and it's the first time I've spoken about it actually. So you're my test case, folks. There's not going to be a vote at the door, but just I'm letting you in on the secret. The emancipatory power of a meta theory for indigeneity as a site both of resistance to ongoing colonialism and regeneration of indigenism. Okay, so kind of polar opposites, kind of playing off each other, a side of tension. I wrote this myself down the bottom because I've been wanting to say that for years at the conference. But also an antidote to universalising assumptions of Western theory, knowledge and practice about everything. Okay, so what it is an attempt to just keep on going. That's all it's been, folks. Just keep on walking and see where you end up. And I think this is where we end up. How do we, colonialism, indigenism? What I'm positing is that it's a site of tension. It is ongoing tension. But equally, it's a site of creativity. Wherever there's tension, there's creativity. How do we deal with this tension? How do we manage? How do we moderate? How do we mediate it? But not only that, a site for resistance, a site for regeneration, decolonisation, partnership, co-governance, and hopefully tino rangatira. Okay, and just finally, I want to conclude with another slide because we're in the middle of this again. Okay, so that, meanwhile, back at the car, what I'm saying is so, and that's why I think frameworks like that are absolutely critical. Otherwise, decisions are continuing to be made by others. So, meanwhile, back at the car, Cyclone Gabrielle years ago, the part that I grew up in, the whenua and surrounds the zone category 3 with very minimal consultation with our hapu. So our hapu has had to vacate our Hopakanga, our marae, and all of that, and had to move. And they are in the process of moving at the moment. But as I say, there was minimal consultation, no more building permits or consents to be issued. Meanwhile, the adjoining Petane Pa timber paper mill stays, and high-cost coastal housing along Matunga Drive on the coast is protected by a stop bank. Okay, so the protection by a stop bank has turned our Hopakanga into a floodplain. Okay. So all I'm saying, I'm really just making a point, and that is, unless we can move to that and fully define our world, we're going to have problems like this within the context of climate change, adaptation, management, treatment, and the rest of it. I think that's it. Did I make? Oh,
Brilliant. Magnificent. An opportunity for questions. Reflections.
Come on, folks. That was a provocation.
My name's Grant. I was my way for Greeks and work with Indigenous communities in Asia. And yeah, thank you very much for your presentation. My comment firstly on your resistance to regeneration, I like it a lot. I think we're also discussing the move from being victims to being protagonists and being basically on the front foot. How many, for so long being victims, now being protagonists. So I like the framing there. But my question is to get your views on the role of maps in the colonisation process and planning process, which we deal with a lot, briefly, with maps and the power of maps, and trying to support communities and using maps for their own power as well.
Yeah.
And so I'd be interested to hear your comment on how Māori, how Indigenous people would like to use maps in Indigenous planning and taking it forward from there.
Okay, I think the first iwi management plan, Te Whare, they did map, they literally mapped self-determination as it applied to them. Like they physically mapped it out. So that has been happening anyway, and that is already happening. And many tribes are already using mapping as a process. So it's about mapping their reality, mapping their world. So it might not look like the kind of map you can, the Collins map, whatever it is, but it's using your own approaches to map out your reality. Because mapping in colonial times was a major technique for land confiscation. Yeah, so like when I talk about planning, I add mapping into that as well. I mean, while we're on it, surveying, creating boundaries, bounding things in, losing or trampling on our mobilities as people. We were seasonal, we migrated, we went up to Lake Hawea to gather kaimwa, for instance. So this notion of mobilities has been really squashed in terms of this notion of so-called Western, I don't even know this term, but mapping. Because what it does is it fixes everything into a fixed boundary. Once you do that, you're creating a legal boundary. Once you're creating a legal boundary, you're creating a title. It just keeps on going on and on and on. So even though I've referred primarily to planning, I think there are a number of other practices and disciplines that are on this kind of continuum as well. Mapping is definitely there. Surveying, planning, policy making, planning, and then design. They're all there. So there's got to be a counter to all of that. So I would say, counter mapping, or some to that effect. And mapping not as we would otherwise see it in conventional sort of Western terms, but quite different, So, that's another way to deal with that. Yeah.
Stand here. Thank you.
Yeah, please. I really appreciate you mentioned the word creativity between the tension, the colonialism and the indigenism. It seems like I agree. Like when two civilizations, when they collide, a new generation, a new civilization may get born. But my question is, if everything is between the colonialism and indigenism, the tension between them, it's like a very Foucauldian power structure. So my question is, if we want to know something happened before the colonization, even before the indigenization, indigeneity. That means no human species at all. So at that time, no colonization, no decolonization, no everything. But the world is still there. About that world, we cannot have like this tension of epistemology or ontology, right? This should be something objective, independent of our perspective, independent of our human conflict or human.
You're talking about pre-human.
Yes.
Yeah.
So if the human does not exist at all, so no colonization at all. So that world, long history, billions of years, how are we gonna know that? In which perspective we're gonna know that?
The pre-human.
Forget about evolution.
Yeah.
Or original life, original planet, the universe, the stuff, the whole fund of knowledge. How are we gonna know that?
Well, I could tell you in Māori traditional knowledge, there is what we call a cosmogony. That takes you all the way back to creation. So there are traditional knowledges that articulate the kind of whakapapa of knowledge, and I think that's what you're talking about, including to pre-human times. So a lot of these are really culturally constructed, but in the context of Mātauranga Māori, there's whakapapa of knowledge that goes back in time, pre-human, you know, back to the creation, wherever the creation was, back to the abyss. So it's already there.
So the one version or two versions of that? The colonial Western version or indigenous version? Or?
Well, read the Bible.
Yeah. I have a question toward the future with the revisions to the Resource Management Act. Coming, Indigenous planning involved. We heard from Hamish Rennie a couple of weeks ago around his perspective, how important is it to keep the Indigenous planning aspect of the resource management?
Yeah.
Is it? What's your thoughts on that?
Oh, Indigenous planning and resource management.
And future as well.
I think it's absolutely critical, but I think inclusion in the RMA along the lines that I've just explained. Firstly, recognising that let's go back to that, right? I think there needs to be a recognition of that in our planning system. And in the RMA somehow, I think that would deal with it. Because then what would be needed would be the creation of a process to mediate across these that. But what is needed is a mechanism in the RMA to allow that to happen. Now, clearly, iwi management plans, I think, are a good start because they're expressions of tino rangatira. And therefore, they have an authoritative truth because they're centred within the iwi. So I think the ability to take an iwi management plan and somehow comprehend it in a district or regional plan is the critical issue. Now, I'm not sure that our planning instruments and our planning tools are able to do that. And I'm not seeing too much evidence of that. I mean, they're okay with the expressions of kaitia, but bedding it down in policy, I think has been a bit of a challenge.
Thank you.
But iwi management plans are a really good tool to start with.
Opportunity for two last questions. I'll come for one here, please.
Yes, your hokai that got decimated during Cyclone Gabriel, was that under the RMA? If the council had looked through that lens, then what could have the outcome been for your papakainga?
I think the outcome would have been different.
Yes.
I think the outcome would have been different, but they weren't looking through that lens. The decision had already been made on the basis of kind of science, you know, engineering, technology, and the rest of it, but not on the basis of this. You know, we have so much to lose. and you know we're in the process of losing. So I think if the Hawke's Bay Regional Council had used something such as that, they might have ended up in a different place. But what they ended up in is making quite a unilateral decision.
With no consultation.
Very minimal consultation because, sorry.
It's ridiculous in this day and age.
I know, and I think, yeah, that was the problem. So, but anyway, our upland has already moved anyway, because the ability to insure was removed. Building permits and building consents were denied. So we've had to move. But that's what I'm arguing for in this presentation, is a return to that thinking to govern the way that we do planning, or at least engage planning.
How do we get
How do we get there? I'm not sure. It's going to be a big job. I'm not going to be yet, so you know. No, look, I think it's all about firstly acknowledging that. I think it's critical, and it's that mediation across that. That is where the tension is. But what we do need is we need theoretical frameworks, practice frameworks to actually do that. And I think there's the issue. So I'm putting up a proposition to help facilitate that.
Do you think it's through education? I'm aware in the education sector there has been a move to really incorporate
Yes.
colonialism and yeah, and that's been extant for a long time.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's harder. I mean, it's been dismantled at the moment, but it has been integrity in the past. They've been very political and hopeful. And that's education.
That's good. And
That's education.
yeah, but that's quite recent as well. I mean, you know, the dualities that I've been talking about were expunged from our education system until relatively recent. So I think there have been challenges through the education context as well.
It's brought into teacher education.
Yes, yeah.
So that's how it sort of comes through the ranks, I suppose.
Yeah, well hopefully.
Kira, we might wrap up there. Paul. Question.
Okay. Matunga, I'm going to Matunga to briefly more really the fact of one the part-time meeting of observation, but it's just to acknowledge the brilliant leadership you provided, not just here at Lincoln, but across the nation with all of our people. It's been wonderful to find myself here under your umbrella as you're about to leave, and really kind of getting a hot light of the climate change. And for those that don't know me, I've been fortunate enough to become as director of the Kaika Institute, Climate Resilience here. And what Matua has been talking about here is very much about what the Institute is going to take forward, because guidance is left behind. And in particular, this duality that we are seeking, we realise that since 1991, the evolution of the power of the Crown into regional and local government, and the reason we called the Institute Kaika is to take it back into that wide hapu space where on the ground impact is occurring, and empower them, not with iwi management plans, but with local community hapu marae, face to face, talking with the leadership of the Crown's local and regional governments, and making a difference at that level. So I just want to acknowledge the inspiration you provided for the next generation of academia and planning that's occurring in this country.
Beautiful words there. Harini, many thanks for your presentation today, for your stellar career at Lincoln University and at other places in planning. I think in my role as Vice Chancellor, I'm very fortunate to be able to chair these sessions. And one thing I really appreciate is often I don't hear people talk. And this is the first time I've ever heard him talk in a presentation. And I'm very proud that I've actually been able to be here today to hear him and witness this and the power of his words in Indigenous climate. Thank you very much. Thank you. Refreshments.